Hello everybody, welcome back. This is a video for maritime students out there on how to get started with that first row of stitches, the flat stitch on the side of your ditty bag. You can see here I've got my waxed twine that we're using. Mine's brown, but you guys have the white stuff, but it's already waxed. So it stays together nicely and it'll pull through the canvas a little bit easier. I've got this that's just a seam rubber so that I can fold over the hems and get that fabric to have a memory in it so that it has a fold to it. And then I got my sewing needle and some pins and a little block of wood to sort of use instead of a palm when I'm sewing and I want to push the fabric down over the needle, so you don't be putting the end of the needle into your folks' dining room table like I'm using here. So you got your canvas all laid out, and on the long side you have the half-inch hem. Half-inch hem goes all the way around, but on the top of this you also have your 2-inch line that'll be the sew-to line for the top hem. On the right hand side you've got the hem as well, and you can see mine's already folded over, and I had some double stick tape, so I put that in there to hold that down. But I also have this sew-to line that is 2 inches in from the edge. All the way around on my hemline, I've folded it one way and I folded it back. This is what the seam rubber is nice for, so that when I do this, I'm pressing this down, making a nice flat fold, and then I fold it the other way so that I can get those fibers nice and soft. On the top and the bottom hems, I've folded those over and back, and now I'm folding those flat. So when I sew this first seam, I don't have those down, they're up. The reason is when we come back to put in the bottom and the top, you already have that memory in the fabric, so it makes a nice even hem, and it's easier to do than when it's all rolled up. Okay, so the first step is you've got this laid out. You've got this hem folded up on the right hand side, and you've got this hem on the left hand side folded down, so it's folded underneath. As you remember, what we want when we put these together is not those hems to be interlocked like this, because then you're going to be sewing through 2 extra layers of canvas, and you don't want that. So you want them like this, so you're only sewing at the edges of them. So take my fabric, and I'm going to flip this over and roll it. So now that hem that has the line, my line is right there, my hem is up. On the other one, I'm going to roll this over to get to that line, and then I'm going to line up my edge along that pencil line that we made. So once I get that lined up, I'm going to take my straight pins and I'm going to pin this so that it doesn't move when I'm sewing. We want this to end up a tube, and if you don't pin it, it kind of ends up looking like a cone. So here's the top. We've got our top hem. We've got this line here. I pick up the upper layers. Remember, don't pin it together. Take my T-pin, and you don't need to be all the way at the top here, a couple inches down. All you're doing is keeping it from moving. So take your pin, go in, flip it forward, go down away from you, don't put it in your finger, and then you can tuck the end in if you want, but have them pointing away from you so that as you're sewing you don't have that sharp point pointing towards your finger. You don't want to keep poking yourself. So flatten that out, smooth out where you pinned, get the dimples out of there, and then see where you are. Where I put it in there made a little bit off, so I'm just going to fix that. Okay, and then you really only need 3 or 4. I'm going to move these down as I sew, so the ones that at the top I can put in further down. But you want to make sure that your pieces don't go over one another too far, again, because then you end up sewing through too many layers. But then you also have a bag that's more of a cone shape than a tube, and that's not what you want. Alright, so I've pinned my stitch, or my hem that I'm going to stitch right along here. I'm starting at the top here, and I'm going to make sure that when I sew, I'm going down through the side that has a single layer, and then I'm going to come up through the side that has 3 layers. So obviously it's going to be harder to push that up, and again, that's where my wood block is going to come in and give me something to push the needle down, or push the fabric down over the needle. This is where you would normally use a sailmaker's palm, that's like a big thimble, but in lieu of that, we're going to use a block of wood. So I've got my wax twine here. I'm going to take about 1/2 fathom and cut that off. That's 3 feet for you lubbers. Now, I didn't do a great job here. You can see the yarns on my thread are kind of frayed out there. Nice thing with this wax twine is you can kind of twist it and pull it and work a little bit of that wax over the end of it, and it kind of all goes together, because these needles aren't always easy to thread with this big twine. So I'm going to thread my needle, but remember, we don't sew with double thread. This thread is strong enough that we don't want to be trying to pull 2 layers of this through every time we sew. So pull about 6 inches of the twine through, and then as you sew, you're going to pull this, and once it gets past there, you're going to make sure you don't just pull the needle off of the thread, but then it's going to leave a single thread. So this is going to be tucked into our hem, so we can just tie a knot in the end of it. Sometimes you don't want a knot in the end, because again, this is this whole thing, the whole ditty bag really is an example of how to do a stitch that you might need to do to say repair a sail or canvas at sea. And you don't want big knots, and you don't want big thread sticking up, because that chafes, and then eventually that thread gets worn through and your seam is open. So what this is replicating is a very strong seam, right? We've got a row of stitches on this side and a row of stitches on this side. So all of the stress on this seam is spread out between those 2 rows. So this is a really strong way to tie something, and you'll be able to hold a lot of weight in your ditty bag. You'll see that you can stuff it really tight, which is nice. So when I start, I'm going down on my right here through that single layer and then up, and I'm trying to get the needle to go straight over, and then when I do a new stitch, I'm going to go down a little. So I put my needle in. A lot of times you put it in and it sort of pops through, and you got to pull it back so that the tip of it is right where you want it. And then I'm just trying to go straight over, and I don't want my stitches to be too long, because then again they stick up and they'll make big loops that get caught. But I don't want them to be too short. I don't need to be working in there really tightly. So about as wide as the stitch is, I want to take about the same amount and go down. So from this first stitch where it comes out on the left, I'm going to go back down on my right, straight across, pull the needle back a little bit. So say I missed it. Say I went too far out on this one. Let me get that pin out of the way. Say I went too far out on this one. That's okay. I just pull my needle back and put it in the right one. This is again the top row. When you look on the other side, these stitches should go at an angle. When you look on the other side, they'll be straight across, because when you're putting it in, you're trying to go straight across from where you went in. So you see I'm pushing down on my block of wood so that I have enough force. Don't try to do it against your hand. It's too hard to do it, and just use the force pushing the fabric over and down onto the block of wood. One of the things you want to be sure you don't do is tie knots in it. So when I pull my needle up, I want to make sure that my loop of thread isn't around it, because then when I get tight, you can see I'm just making a knot, and then I got to come back and fix that. I don't want to have to do that. So as you go along, you're going a little further down. You're trying to keep your stitches right below one another, so that keeps them the same size. You can see my first one's a little bit bigger. That's okay, because this whole thing gets rolled over in the end. But I'm trying to start my next stitch straight down from the last one, and then I'm trying to take my needle out straight below where my last stitch came out. So you get about 8-10 stitches in. You don't want to make a ridge. That's what this is called, the flat stitch. So that's why we took all that time to flatten that hem out. And we're not just picking up and pinching, right? If I do this and just pick up and pinch my seam and then start sewing through there, what that's going to end up doing is creating this tight ridge where that fabric is heaped up. And again, that puts a ridge on here rather than being a flat stitch, which is what then gets chafed and wears through. So once I get a couple inches of stitches, what I want to do is come back and tighten them. And again, I'm not trying to make a ridge here, but if I take my needle and I go underneath here, and I just see how I'm just pulling whatever slack there is on the back side, I pull that tight, and then I go to the next one. And I'm not pulling too tight, but you can see all I'm doing is tightening those stitches, and I've already pulled an extra, quarter inch or so into a loop here. So tighten your stitches up, and then try not to get your needle through the twine when you do this. You can poke it into it and kind of separate the individual fibers there. You don't want to do that. So there's some nice stitches. This last one's a little bit bigger. I check to make sure I'm not sewing my bag together, because if I do, then I have to go back and take those stitches out. But the great thing about sewing is if I need to go back and redo that one, I can either just pull my thread out of my needle and pull that back and redo it, or I can come back and just cut these out and start all over. It's not a great waste of materials or anything. As I keep going, I'm going to take my pins out, and I'm going to move it down to this next section so that I make sure I don't get ahead of my pins while I'm sewing. And then I get to the end and I finish up with another knot. When I get to a certain point that I need to finish, I run out of thread. You can tuck that in on the inside. You can tuck your thread in on the inside and tie a knot on the back side, and then start with a new one. So remember, going down on the single side, coming up on this, don't poke your needle through and then find it on the back side and have to fish it back out. Imagine doing that and you've got a sail sitting in your lap, and you've got thousands of square feet of material, and having to do that on every stitch. Find where you went in on that side and then flip it over. It's an inefficient way to do your sewing, so you want to try to do it all from the top, going in through the 1, out through the 3, press it down, pull it out, keep it flat. So there we go. We do one row of flat stitches on this side, and then we flip the whole thing inside out and do another row on that side. You don't have to pin it on the back side. It's not going to move this way, but you also want to make sure you don't get any dimples or high spots in it on that side. So make sure you keep it flat. All right, well, happy sewing. That is the first stitch, the flat stitch of our ditty bag. And when you're done with that, we'll move on to the top and the bottom. All right, we'll see you later.